Welcome to this evening's ministry with Pastor David. I'll open our ministry. We gather as sovereign beings under the lawful design of life encoded within each of us. In the sacred space of the Sovereign Systems Institute, we pause to recognize our jurisdiction, our capacity, and our contract with the natural order. May our words and decisions align with the resiliency code and generate sovereign wealth for ourselves and all who will follow the resilient path. Tonight, we're exploring the resource field. And I want to start with something that's going to reframe how most of you think about money. Money is not the point. I know that sounds strange coming from someone who's going to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes talking about the resource field, but stay with me. Money is a channel. It's one of several channels of flow that either support your capacity across all 9 fields or hemorrhage it. The moment you make money the point, you've already lost the structure. You've confused the channel with the destination. And most people, most families, most generations have made exactly that mistake. They've built their entire lives around the accumulation of money and then watched it evaporate within 2 generations because they never built the capacity to steward it. That's what tonight is about. Not money, flow. The architecture of how resources move through your life and either build something that lasts or disappears into a pattern you never knew existed. 80% of American families lose inherited wealth by the 2nd generation. 90% lose it by the 3rd. You've heard me say that over and over and over again. I've quoted that statistic in this ministry before, and every time I do, people nod. They've heard it, they believe it, and then they go home and do exactly what the first generation did that produced that outcome. Because the pattern isn't a mystery, it's documented. The first generation builds wealth through discipline. Self-interest in survival required resource literacy. They knew what things cost. They knew how to create value. They understood the relationship between effort and output. The 2nd generation spends without understanding how it was created. Self-interest in comfort permitted it. They inherited the outcome without the capacity that produced it. The 3rd generation inherits resource incompetence. They destroy everything that remains through ignorance or entitlement. Not because they're bad people, because resource capacity was never transferred. They never had the choice. And here's the part that cuts deepest. The industry built around managing your money has no interest in breaking this pattern. Financial advisors whose fee structure requires your permanent dependency. Credit card companies whose margin require your debt. Retirement industry products that assume you'll never build independent resource capacity. Tax preparation firms whose revenue depends on you never understanding strategy. Their self-interest requires your resources to stay outsourced. Your financial illiteracy is their business model. I'm not saying don't use professionals. I'm saying know what you're working with and know what it costs you when you don't. The resource field is people, tools, money, and time. Not just money, all 4. Most people think about this field exclusively through the financial lens. What's in the bank? What's invested? What's owed? And they completely ignore the other 3 channels of flow. People, who you have access to, who has access to you, and whether those relationships are generating resource capacity or consuming it. Your network is a resource. Your expertise shared with the right people is a resource. Your reputation in the right circles is a resource. These are channels of flow that most people never consciously build or protect. Tools. The physical and intellectual implements that allow you to create value. A tradesman without his tools is just a man. A strategist without frameworks is just someone with opinions. The tools you own, maintain, and deploy determine the quality and efficiency of what you can build. They allow you to produce more than your raw time and labor can generate alone. Time, the most precious, finite resource in this field and the most poorly stewarded. Every hour you spend in wrong relationship, every hour you spend in misaligned vocation, every hour you spend consuming rather than producing is a resource expenditure that cannot be recovered. Time doesn't accumulate. It only flows in one direction. And money, which matters enormously, but only in right relationship to the other three. When those four channels are flowing with structural integrity, your resource field capacity expands. When one of those channels collapses, the others feel it immediately. Your field destabilizes and begins to hemorrhage capacity. When your resource field collapses, it doesn't stay isolated. And I want to be specific about this because I've watched it happen across dozens of families. The body takes the first hit. Financial stress is physical stress. Cortisol floods your system. Immune function drops. And cardiovascular load builds quietly in the background. Your nervous system doesn't distinguish between a predator and a past due notice. It responds the same way to both. And chronic money anxiety is chronic physical field collapse, whether it looks like it or not. Then the decisions stop making sense. When every choice gets filtered through financial fear rather than honest evaluation, you stop asking what's right and start asking what you can afford. Those are completely different questions, and they produce completely different outcomes. The emotional field can't regulate under that kind of constant pressure, and the intellectual field isn't far behind. You can't think strategically when survival is dominating every calculation. Reactive thinking is the most expensive thinking there is because the decisions you make from that state almost always cost more than the crisis you were reacting to. And once those fields are compromised, the rest follow. The creative field goes quiet because there's no margin for experimentation when consumption is eating everything. Relationships start bending around money in ways that corrode them slowly. You start measuring people by what they cost or what they produce, and that's the end of authentic connection. Work becomes something you do to survive rather than something you build from. You take what you can get instead of doing what you're built to do. A compromised resource field cascades through every other field you're trying to build. This is why stewardship here is non-negotiable. Here's the distinction that most people never make. Most people build what I call borrowed security. Everything flows through external sources they don't fully understand or control. An advisor makes the calls. Debt funds the lifestyle. One employer controls the income. Complex financial instruments require permanent expert management. The safety net is a government program or someone else's eventual estate. None of that is inherently wrong. The problem is when it becomes your only strategy. When the channel is flowing, but you have no idea how the plumbing works. Because when those external systems fail, and they do fail, borrowed security evaporates. You've outsourced your resource capacity so completely that you can't navigate without the support structure you depended on. Owned capacity is different. It's not about being wealthy. It's about understanding your own financial architecture well enough to make decisions without permanent dependency. It's having more than one stream of income, so no single source controls your survival. It's having built skills that create value regardless of which employer or platform exists this year. It's holding liquid reserves that let you navigate market cycles without panic. I've been through the 2000 tech crash, the 2008 financial crisis, the 2020 pandemic disruption, and the current AI displacement cycle accelerating right now. Every one of those events destroyed people who built borrowed security and couldn't navigate when the external support disappeared. Every one of those same events created opportunities for people who had built owned capacity, not luck, structure. Here's what I've observed over more than 40 years of watching families build and lose wealth. The first generation almost always has resource literacy. They learned it through necessity. They know how to create value. They understand what things cost to produce. They have direct experience with the relationship between work and outcome. What they almost never transfer is that literacy. They transfer the money. They transfer the house, the business, the accounts, but not the understanding that produced those things. And the next generation receives assets without the operating knowledge required to steward them. It's like inheriting a ship without learning to navigate. You have the vessel, you just can't get anywhere without hitting something. Resource literacy is what we're building here. Not a prescription for how to invest, not financial advice. The structural architecture that allows you to make resource decisions with sovereignty instead of dependency. What does resource literacy look like in practice? It looks like knowing what your money is actually doing, not because you manage every transaction, but because you understand the architecture. It looks like knowing what your time is worth and making deliberate decisions about what you trade it for. Because every hour is a resource deployment, and most people deploy theirs reactively. It looks like maintaining the tools and relationships that extend your productive capacity and protecting them with the same intentionality you'd apply to a financial asset. And it looks like building more than one channel of resource flow so no single source controls your stability. One income stream is a single point of failure. Multiple streams built over time is architecture. The $1 trillion question in this ministry, in the Resilient Path series of books, in everything we're building at SSI is this. How do you transfer human capacity across generations, not just assets? Because the data is clear. 80% of families fail at the financial transfer by the second generation. And the financial failure is almost always preceded by a capacity failure that nobody saw because nobody understood the relationships between all 9 of your fields. The children inherited money. They didn't inherit the resource literacy that produced it. They didn't inherit the understanding of how flow works and what interrupts it. They didn't inherit the discipline of stewardship. They inherited an outcome without the process. And when you separate outcome from process across generations, the outcome disappears within 2 generations every single time. What you can transfer, what this ministry is designed to help you build and transfer, is the architecture, the understanding of how channels flow, the literacy that allows the next generation to navigate their own resource decisions with sovereignty instead of dependency. That transfer doesn't happen through a will. It doesn't happen through an estate plan. It happens through the daily demonstration of resource stewardship that your family, your extended family, and other colleagues observe across decades of interactions with you. They're watching how you talk about money, whether it's a source of anxiety or a tool you understand. They're watching how you deploy your time, whether it evaporates into consumption or builds towards something deliberate. They're watching how you maintain your tools and relationships, whether those things are stewarded or neglected. That observation becomes their operating architecture in one way or another, long before anything is transferred. Here's the resilient path through the resource field. Pause. Recognize where your resource field is actually positioned right now, not where you think it should be, not where you plan for it to be, where it actually is. What channels are flowing? What channels are blocked or hemorrhaging? Where is the dependency concentrated? What would collapse if a single source disappeared? Don't judge what you find. Read it as structural data. The resource field communicates its state clearly if you're willing to look honestly. Prepare. Build resource literacy before you need it. The worst time to start understanding your financial architecture is during a crisis. The best time is now, when you have margin to learn, experiment, and make small mistakes that teach rather than catastrophic ones that destroy. Start with what you actually own and what you actually owe. Get honest about the channels. Understand what your time is actually worth and where it's actually going. Identify what skills you have that create value independently of your current employment or income source. That inventory is the beginning of resource literacy. Participate. Deploy resources strategically across all 9 fields, not just financial resources, all 4 channels: people, tools, time, and money. Ask every resource deployment, is this strengthening capacity across multiple fields, or is this extraction? Is this building something that appreciates or consuming something that disappears? That question, applied consistently over years and decades, is the difference between the family that beats the 80% statistic and the family that becomes it. The resource field doesn't require wealth to steward. It requires literacy. The families that transfer successfully across generations aren't always the wealthiest ones. They're the ones where resource literacy moved alongside the resources. Build the literacy. Transfer the architecture. Steward what flows through your hands with the same intentionality you bring to every other field. Collapse is optional, but only if your resource field is built on owned capacity, not borrowed security. I'll now close our ministry this evening. Having prepared through this fellowship, we return to participate from our individual sovereignty, carrying the coherence generated here into our respective fields, in service to the lawful design of life and the continuation of this work. Next week, the faith field, the anchor of meaning. Take care, everyone.